My eyes fell on the map. The red yarn connected a series of seemingly random points: a public library, a derelict shipyard, an old theater, the courthouse, the stock exchange. And in the center, circled in black ink, was the Olympian Tower. Reed hadn't just been investigating Croft, he'd been investigating a pattern. A pattern that had gotten him killed. I noticed a file on his desk, separate from the others. It was labeled simply, ominously, the Albatross. I tucked it under my coat. Whatever it was, Reed had thought it was important. That was good enough for me. As I moved to leave, I heard footsteps on the creaking stairs outside. I ducked into a closet that smelled of mothballs and old wool, pulling the door almost shut. Through the crack, I saw two bulky men in cheap suits enter the apartment. They weren't cops. They moved with a purpose, quickly scanning the room, their eyes missing nothing. One of them spoke into his wrist. "It's clean. The package is gone." They left as quickly as they came. My heart was hammering. Someone else was looking for the file. I backed out of the apartment, carefully wiping the doorknob with my handkerchief. As I descended the stairs, the city outside seemed darker, more menacing. The game had changed. This wasn't just about Harrison Croft anymore. It was about a series of murders, a dead journalist, and a killer who moved through the city like a phantom, leaving behind a trail of feathers and bodies. Back in the relative safety of my car, the engine ticking over, I opened the file. It was filled with old newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and Reed's own frantic, handwritten notes. The stories were all decades old, cold cases the APD had long since forgotten. A socialite who vanished from her own party. A banker who walked into the river with his pockets full of stones. The judge drowned in ink. The stockbroker with a mouthful of gold. The connection wasn't the method, it was the victims. According to Reed's meticulous, obsessive notes, every single one of them, including Harrison Croft, had been part of a secret society, an informal club of the city's elite who met decades ago. They called themselves the Albatross Club. And scrawled at the bottom of the last page, in Reed's shaky handwriting, were three words that made the bourbon in my stomach turn to ice. "They're all guilty." Guilty of what? The file didn't say. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was no longer just investigating a murder. I was digging up a grave, and I had no idea what kind of ghosts I was about to awaken. My next stop was the city archives, a dusty, forgotten mausoleum of public records where the city's history went to die. The air inside was still and smelled of decaying paper and time itself. I spent hours hunched over a microfilm reader, the world shrinking to the glowing green screen, my eyes burning as I scrolled through old newspapers and society pages from 30 years ago. And there it was, a single photograph from a charity gala, the image grainy and faded. A group of young, arrogant men in tuxedos, their faces flushed with champagne and the casual cruelty of youth. They were smiling for the camera, glasses raised in a toast to their own invincibility. The caption listed their names. Harrison Croft was there, looking impossibly young and full of unchecked ambition. And standing next to him were the other victims from Reed's file: the banker, the judge, the stockbroker, the Albatross Club. But there were other faces in the photo, too. Faces I didn't recognize. One of them was a man named Sterling Hayes. And another. One face in particular stood out. A young man, standing slightly apart from the others, a shadow of a smile on his lips that didn't quite reach his dark, intense eyes. He looked out of place, a poet in a room full of predators. His name, according to the caption, was Julian Thorne. I searched for him in the city records. There was a birth certificate, a college enrollment for an arts degree, and then nothing. After that year, it was as if Julian Thorne had ceased to exist. He had become a ghost. A ghost with a motive? Perhaps. I decided to track down the other living member from the photo, Sterling Hayes. He lived in the city's old money district, in a crumbling Gothic mansion that looked like it was slowly being consumed by the ivy that crawled up its stone walls. The place was a fortress of paranoia. After a long argument through an intercom, a butler who looked older than the house itself let me in. Sterling Hayes was a ghost in his own right. A frail, bird-boned man lost in a cavernous, dusty room, surrounded by cupboard furniture. He was agoraphobic, his eyes wide with a terror that had been simmering for 30 years. "They told you I was here," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle. "He's coming for me next." "The boy by the sea, Julian Thorne?" I asked. Hayes flinched as if I'd struck him. "Don't say that name. The walls have ears. We made a mistake. A terrible, youthful mistake. We were gods, we thought. But we created a devil. A devil who crawled out of the water." He refused to say more, his fear a palpable thing in the still air. He threw me out, screaming about a debt that had finally come due. The puzzle was getting bigger, the pieces more scattered. A secret society, a series of ritualistic murders decades apart, a dead journalist, and a phantom named Julian Thorne. It was a Gordian knot, and every thread I pulled only seemed to tighten it. That night, sleep offered no escape. My dreams were a feverish, disjointed collage of the case. Dead blackbirds with human eyes that followed me. A rain of white feathers that turned to snow, burying me. And a faceless man in a tuxedo, laughing a silent, chilling laugh that echoed in the hollows of my skull. I woke up in a cold sweat. The sheets tangled around me like a shroud, the dream's oppressive atmosphere clinging to me long after I was awake. I found myself checking the lock on my door, a prickle of paranoia on my skin. I needed a drink, not in my office, but somewhere with people, somewhere the silence couldn't get so loud. I ended up at the Blue Dahlia, a jazz club tucked away in an alley that smelled perpetually of rain and regret. The smoke was thick enough to carve, and a lone trumpet player was bleeding his soul out onto the stage. I was nursing a bourbon when a voice slid through the smoke, smooth as the velvet on the seats. "You look like a man carrying the world on his shoulders, detective." She was a lounge singer, the kind the club kept for the late set. Her name was Lila Vance. She had eyes that had seen too much and a voice that promised to make you forget it all, just for a little while. Her dress was the color of a deep bruise, and she moved with a weary grace. "The world's a heavy place," I said. "Tell me about it," she replied, taking the stool next to me. "I hear you're the one asking questions about Harrison Croft." My guard went up. "News travels fast in this town. Faster than the truth," she said, a sad smile playing on her lips. I knew one of them. The one they found with gold in his mouth. The stockbroker. His name was Michael. He used to come in here. A sad man, always looking over his shoulder. He told me once, when he was deep in his cups, about a club he was in when he was young. Said they did something terrible. Something that left a stain on all their souls. "The Albatross Club," I said. It wasn't a question. She nodded slowly. "He was terrified. Said a ghost was coming for them. A ghost with the memory of the sea in its eyes." Lila became a fixture in the case. A source. Maybe more. She knew the city's whispers, the secrets the powerful told their mistresses and bartenders after the third drink. She was a dangerous distraction, a single point of warmth in a world that was growing colder by the hour. My investigation into the other dramatist killings led me to a retired cop, a man named O'Malley, who'd been the lead on the case of the judge drowned in red ink. I found him in a fisherman's bar by the polluted river, a place that smelled of fried fish and stale beer. He was a wreck, his hands trembling from a combination of age and cheap whiskey. "The dramatist," he slurred, his eyes haunted. "That was no man. That was a phantom. The crime scenes, they were perfect. Too perfect. Like they were ripped from a storybook. We always felt like we were one step behind, reading a script he'd already written. He told me something that had never made the papers. At each scene, besides the main theatrical element, the killer had left a small, almost invisible clue. A line of poetry scrawled on the back of a drawer, a pressed flower tucked into a victim's pocket. It was a private conversation he was having with the dead. The paranoia was getting worse. I had another blackout. I woke up in my car, parked outside the derelict shipyard on Reed's map. The engine was cold. I'd lost 3 hours. My knuckles were bruised and scraped. I had no idea how it happened. I was starting to feel like I was a ghost in my own life, watching a man named Jack Corrigan go through the motions. Before approaching Eleanor again, I needed another angle. The name Thorne wasn't common. A little digging led me to an office at Ambrose University. Dr. Horace Thorne, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma and dissociative disorders. The plaque on his door was muted brass. Julian's brother. Horace was the opposite of the boy in the photo. Where Julian was slight and poetic, Horace was solid, grounded. He had the same intense eyes, but his were filled with a clinical sadness, not artistic melancholy. He listened patiently as I told him I was a private investigator looking into a cold case that might be connected to his brother's disappearance. I left out the part about the murders. For now, Julian, he said, the name a sigh. I haven't seen my brother in 30 years. He was fragile, a brilliant mind, but one that saw the world in shades of tragedy and beauty the rest of us are blind to. He fell in with a bad crowd. The sons of the city's elite. They were like a pack of glittering wolves, and he was something they wanted to devour. What do you think happened to him? Dr. Thorne steepled his fingers, his gaze analytical. I've spent a lifetime considering that question, Mr. Corrigan. Did he run away? Did he take his own life? Or did they do something to him? Their parents closed ranks. The police were unhelpful. The story was that he was unstable, that he simply vanished. He paused. There's a psychological phenomenon known as a fugue state. Trauma can cause a person to sever their connection to their own identity, to literally become someone else in order to survive. They can build an entire new life, a new personality, with no memory of the person they were before. A complete fiction to house a broken truth. His words hung in the air-conditioned silence of his office, chilling me for reasons I couldn't articulate. I left his office with more questions than answers, and with a profound sense of unease. Dr. Thorne's clinical description of a fractured mind felt personal. My next lead was more esoteric. Reed's notes had mentioned a name, the Oracle, an information broker who supposedly operated out of the city's abandoned subway tunnels. Finding him was a descent into the city's forgotten underbelly. I paid off a transit worker who pointed me toward a sealed-off service entrance. The air below ground was cold and damp, smelling of ozone and mildew. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the beam of my flashlight. It was a city beneath the city, a labyrinth of forgotten tracks and silent platforms. I found him in a cavernous, vaulted chamber, lit by a single, bare bulb powered by a jury-rigged generator. He wasn't a man, but a voice, coming from a series of old, networked computers and speakers. A digital ghost in the machine. The detective, the synthesized voice echoed around the chamber. You seek the truth about the Albatross Club. A heavy burden. Like the sailor's curse. I need to know what happened 30 years ago, I said into the darkness. The what is a body? I need the where. The truth is not a location, but a memory, the Oracle rasped. But memories are tied to places. Places of trauma. Places of rebirth. Seek the light that is no longer lit. Where the sea meets the stone, and the gulls cry for the sins of men. The old lighthouse. The one Eleanor had mentioned. Before the pier, one last stop. A name from Reed's notes led me to St. Michael's, a decaying church in the Docks district. its stone stained black by decades of sea salt and pollution. Father Michael was an old man with eyes that had seen too much of the city's sin. He was tending to a small, struggling garden in the church's courtyard. "I can't help you, my son," he said, not looking at me, his hands tending to a rose bush. "The seal of the confessional is absolute. I'm not asking you to break it, Father. But a man is dead. More will follow." Reed's notes said someone confessed. Someone from the club. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a weary sorrow. "A soul came to me, yes, many years ago. He was tormented. He spoke of a terrible sin, a game that became a tragedy. He spoke of a boy who was not a sinner, but was made to carry the sins of others. He said they had weighed down an innocent soul with an albatross, and in doing so, had cursed themselves." Did he say what happened to the boy? He said the boy was lost to the sea, but he spoke of it as if he were talking about a baptism, a death of oneself, and the birth of another. He feared not that the boy was dead, but that he would one day be resurrected. I left him to his roses, the priest's cryptic words echoing in my head. That night, before I headed to the docks, I was in my office. Another blackout. One moment I was staring at the albatross file, the next I was on my knees, a splitting headache behind my eyes. On the floor in front of me was a small, hand-carved bird, made of driftwood. I had no memory of making it, no idea where it had come from. My hands were raw, dotted with splinters. The paranoia was no longer a quiet whisper, it was a screaming in my skull. The hours leading up to midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. I sat in my office, the albatross file open on my desk, a glass of whiskey in my hand. The city outside was quiet, blanketed in a thick, oppressive fog that rolled in from the river, swallowing the streetlights and muffling all sound. It was the kind of night where shadows grew long and twisted, and every creak of the building seemed amplified. I experienced a moment of vertigo, a gap in time. One minute I was looking at the file, the next I was standing by the window, the glass cold against my forehead, with no memory of getting up. I shook it off. Too much coffee, not enough sleep. I checked my .38 revolver, the cold, heavy steel a small comfort in my hand. The 6 bullets in the cylinder felt inadequate. I wasn't walking into this blind. Eleanor Croft was scared, and scared people are unpredictable. They'll do anything to protect their secrets. The North Docks were a skeleton of their former glory, a graveyard of ambition. Rusted cranes stood like silent, skeletal sentinels against the night sky, their arms reaching for a sky they could no longer see. The air was heavy with the smell of salt, creosote, and the slow, inexorable decay of wood and steel. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, the wooden planks of the pier slick with moisture under my worn leather soles. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the black water against the pilings and the mournful, lonely cry of a distant foghorn. It was a sound that spoke of lost ships and drowned men. I saw a figure at the end of the pier, a silhouette in the gloom, looking small and fragile against the vast, empty backdrop of the river. It was her, Eleanor Croft, her expensive coat clutched tightly around her, a lone, elegant figure in a landscape of urban ruin. "You came," she said as I approached, her voice thin and reedy in the thick air, stripped of its earlier confidence. "I'm a glutton for punishment," I replied, my hand never far from the butt of my gun. "Talk to me, Eleanor. Who was Julian Thorne?" She stared out at the black water, her gaze distant, lost in a memory 30 years old. "He was beautiful," she began, her voice soft with a nostalgia that was laced with pain. "An artist, a poet. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't like Harrison. He was gentle, in a world that despises gentle things." She told me the story. A story of a different Ambrose City, 30 years younger but no less cruel. The Albatross Club wasn't just a social club, it was a group of arrogant, privileged young men who thought the world was their personal playground. Julian Thorne, the sensitive artist from a poor family, had somehow fallen into their orbit, drawn by their charisma and power, like a moth to a flame that was destined to burn him. And Eleanor, before she was a Croft, had been in love with him. They were cruel to him, she said, her voice cracking. They saw his gentleness as a weakness. They mocked him, used him for their amusement. Harrison was the worst of them. He was jealous of me, of what Julian and I had. He saw Julian as a rival for a prize he believed was already his. Her story culminated on a night much like this one, on a yacht owned by Harrison Croft's father, out on the dark, unforgiving water of the bay. There was drinking, drugs, a high-stakes poker game. Julian, desperate to be accepted, to prove he wasn't the weakling they thought he was, had played. He lost. He lost everything. Money he didn't have. He owed them a debt he could never repay. They gave him a choice, Eleanor whispered, tears finally streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup and making her look, for the first time, human. A way to clear his debt. They called it the Albatross Trial. It was a game to them. A cruel, sadistic game. They took him out to the old, abandoned lighthouse at the edge of the bay. They were going to hunt him. A human prey, for sport. It was supposed to be a joke, a final, grand humiliation. But something went terribly wrong. I tried to stop them, she sobbed, her body shaking. But Harrison locked me in a cabin. I heard them laughing. Then I heard a gunshot. And then, silence. A terrible, profound silence. When they came back, they were pale, terrified. Boys who had just learned that their games had real consequences. They told me Julian had fallen from the rocks, that it was an accident. They made a pact, right then and there, to never speak of it again. They bought the silence of the authorities, buried the story. Julian Thorne simply vanished. So that was it. The original sin. A 30-year-old murder, covered up by the city's elite. The dramatist wasn't a random madman. He was an avenger. A ghost from the past, come to collect a long overdue debt. It's him, isn't it? I said softly. Julian. He survived. And now he's back. The rain in Ambrose City doesn't just fall, it seeps. It's a patient, persistent rain that finds its way into everything. A liquid melancholy that this city seems to breathe as its native air. It seeps into the cracked asphalt until the streets glisten like obsidian wounds slick with plasma. It worms its way into the mortar of the soot-stained, brick-faced buildings, leaving dark, weeping stains that look like old bruises, mapping out a history of forgotten violence. Most of all, it seeps into the very bones of the people who call this sprawling, concrete necropolis home, leaving a permanent, metaphysical chill that no amount of whiskey can ever truly burn away. It was falling the night I got the call, a relentless, whispering drizzle that coated my office window in a shroud of gray. My office, on the third floor of a building that had given up on aspirations of grandeur around the time of the Second World War, overlooked a narrow street where shadows clung to the architecture like old ivy. The world outside was a Monet of misery. The neon signs of the bars and pawnshops below bled into the wet pavement, their lurid pinks and electric blues blurring into a watercolor painting of sorrow and cheap promises. The city was a beautiful corpse tonight, and the rain was its embalming fluid. My name is Jack Corrigan. I'm a private investigator, which is the $5 word for a man who gets paid to poke at the scabs of this city's society until they bleed truth. Or, more often, until they bleed just enough money to keep the lights on and the wolf from the door. The wolf, in my case, was usually the landlord. A man whose smile had all the warmth of a coroner's slab and whose patience was thinner than a dead man's alibi. The phone's ring was a shrill, impatient javelin of sound that skewered the somber jazz sighing from my old radio. A saxophone wept a lonely tune into the gloom of my office. I let the phone ring a third time. A small, pointless ritual of defiance against a world that was always in a damn hurry to serve you your next portion of grief. Finally, I snatched the receiver. The cold bakelite a familiar, unwelcome weight in my hand. Corrigan, I grunted, my voice gravelly from underuse and overuse of bourbon. The voice on the other end was clipped, official, and weary as the grave. Detective Miller, homicide. Miller and I weren't friends. Friendship is a fragile thing in a city like Ambrose, a delicate piece of china in a city full of bulls, and we were both too chipped and cracked to hold something so delicate. But we shared a certain cynical respect, the kind that grows between two dogs fighting over the same scrap of meat for years. He handled the bodies, I handled the secrets the bodies left behind. We were two sides of the same tarnished coin, spinning through the grimy air. Jack, he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. Got something you might want to see. High profile. Might be a payday in it for you, and God knows you look like you need it. Flattery will get you everywhere. Miller, I said, ignoring the jab. It was true enough. I'm listening. Harrison Croft, the shipping magnate, found him an hour ago in his penthouse at the Olympian Tower. It's a mess. Harrison Croft. The name hung in the air like expensive cigar smoke. He was one of the city's founding princes, a titan of industry whose face was plastered on newspapers and charity gala invitations, always smiling a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He built libraries with one hand and crushed unions with the other. A man who, by all accounts, had no enemies, only competitors he'd already bankrupted. In Ambrose City, a man with no enemies is a man who's hiding them well. Why call me Miller? The APD has a whole army of shiny shoe detectives for this kind of thing. I thought you didn't like private dicks dirtying up your crime scenes. A pause. I could almost hear the weary sigh on the other end, the sound of a man carrying the weight of the city's sins on his broad shoulders. The family is requesting a private consultant. Specifically, you. Your name came up. They want discretion. And, frankly, Jack, this one feels different. It stinks. Everything in Ambrose City stank. It was just a matter of degrees. The sweet, cloying stench of corruption from City Hall, the sour smell of despair from the gutters, the coppery tang of violence in the alleyways. It was a symphony of decay, and I'd long since learned all the notes. Address? He gave it to me. The Olympian Tower, a steel and glass monolith that scraped the perpetually overcast sky, a monument of polished arrogance, a middle finger to the decay festering at its feet. I told him I'd be there in 20. I shrugged on my trench coat, the fabric heavy and damp, a second skin I was born to wear. I grabbed my hat, tilting the brim just so. The face that stared back at me from the small, cracked mirror by the door was a roadmap of late nights and bad decisions, a web of fine lines around tired, cynical eyes, a jaw that had been acquainted with a few fists over the years, and a soul that was more scar tissue than anything else. Outside, the city swallowed me whole. The air was a thick cocktail of wet pavement, exhaust fumes, and the smell of roasting nuts from a street vendor's cart, a smell too cheerful for a night like this. Headlights cut through the gloom, briefly illuminating faces in the crowd, ghostly, anonymous figures hurrying through the night, each one a universe of private darkness, their collars turned up against the rain and the world. The Olympian Tower was an island of sterile opulence in a sea of urban grime. A doorman in a ridiculous, braid-covered uniform eyed me with the kind of disdain usually reserved for insects until I flashed Miller's name. The elevator ride was a silent, swift ascent into another world, a pressurized capsule of polished marble, hushed tones, and expensive, filtered air. It was the kind of place that made you feel poor just by breathing. Miller met me at the penthouse door. He was a big man, built like a retired linebacker, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then left out in the rain for a decade or two. He nodded grimly, the crime scene tape behind him a stark yellow gash against the heavy mahogany door. "Heads up, Jack," he muttered, his breath fogging in the cool air of the hallway. "It's a nasty one. Forensics are still dancing around, so watch your step. The boys from the lab are having a field day." He wasn't lying. The penthouse was a cathedral of wealth, a monument to what a man could buy if he sold enough of his soul. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city's glittering wounds, a god's eye view of the mortals scurrying below. But the luxury was tainted, violated. The air was thick with the coppery, metallic tang of blood, a primal smell that no amount of money could cover up. Harrison Croft lay in the center of a vast, white rug that was now a grotesque work of abstract art, painted in shades of drying crimson. He was dressed in an expensive suit, but his dignity had been violently stripped from him. His eyes, wide and glassy, stared up at a crystal chandelier as if searching for an answer in its cold, glittering facets. The cause of death was brutally obvious, a deep, precise laceration across his throat. But it was the details, the chilling stagecraft of it all, that made the blood run cold. Arranged around him in a perfect, almost compass-point circle, were 7 dead blackbirds. Their small, feathered bodies were stark against the white and red, their beady eyes like chips of obsidian. It wasn't just a murder, it was a ritual, a proclamation, a piece of theater for an audience of one. "The coroner's on his way," Miller said, his voice a low growl. "No forced entry. The security system was disabled from the inside. Code entered perfectly. Whoever did this was either let in, or they were already here when Croft got home." I knelt, my joints protesting, careful not to disturb anything. My eyes scanned the scene, absorbing every detail. The room was pristine, almost surgically clean, apart from the carnage on the rug. No overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle. A half-empty glass of brandy sat on a nearby table, no coaster. It was calm, deliberate, and utterly, terrifyingly insane. "Anything missing?" I asked, my gaze sweeping over the expensive art on the walls, the jade statues in their alcoves. "His wife is in the other room. Eleanor Croft. She says nothing appears to be gone. Not a robbery." "The wife," I said, standing up. "She found him?" Miller shook his head. "The maid. This morning. The wife, Eleanor, says she was asleep in her bedroom at the other end of the penthouse. Heard nothing. Heard nothing." In a place this size, it was plausible. But in my line of work, plausibility is just a pretty mask that guilt often wears. I walked over to the massive window. The rain had picked up, lashing against the glass, distorting the city lights into a fractured, weeping kaleidoscope. 7 blackbirds. It felt biblical, like a page torn from a madman's scripture. This wasn't a crime of passion. Passion is messy, chaotic. This was cold, meticulous. This wasn't about money or love. This was about something else, something older and darker. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, a ghost superimposed over the dying city. I had a feeling this case was going to drag me down into the depths, into the cold, murky waters where Ambrose City kept its most terrible secrets. And as I stood there, with the dead man at my feet and the storm raging outside, I felt a familiar, unwelcome chill. It was the thrill of the hunt, the pull of the abyss. I met Eleanor Croft in a sitting room that was probably larger than my entire apartment block. She was the picture of aristocratic grace, perched on the edge of a silk-covered settee, her posture ramrod straight. She was beautiful, in a severe, sculpted way, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of a winter sky. She clutched a porcelain teacup, but her hand was perfectly steady. Too steady. A woman whose husband was just butchered on the living room rug shouldn't have hands that steady. "Mr. Corrigan," she said, her voice as cool and smooth as the marble floor. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Mrs. Croft," I replied, taking a seat opposite her. The air between us was cold and smelled faintly of lavender and lies. "My condolences. This must be a terrible shock." She took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. Her red lipstick left no mark on the delicate china. "Shock? Yes, I suppose it is. It's all rather theatrical, isn't it? The birds." Harrison always did appreciate a grand gesture. There was no tremor in her voice, no hint of a tear in her cold, clear eyes. Grief manifests in strange ways, but this was something else. This was a chilling, unnatural calm. It was like watching a perfectly crafted automaton go through the motions of mourning. "Did your husband have any enemies?" I asked, cutting through the pleasantries. In my experience, the direct approach was the only way to crack a porcelain facade like hers. She offered a small, brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Harrison was a powerful man, Mr. Corrigan. Powerful men don't have enemies, they have business rivals, competitors, but no one who would do this. This is the work of a madman." "What about his personal life? Any troubles? Affairs?" Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The first crack in the porcelain. "My husband and I had an arrangement. A partnership. We valued our privacy. I suggest you respect that. A man is dead, Mrs. Croft. His dignity was carved out of him and left on that rug. Privacy is a luxury he no longer has." We stared at each other for a long moment. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of secrets she had no intention of sharing. She was a fortress, and I knew right then that getting past her walls would be a siege. "There was a journalist," she finally said, her voice dropping a fraction, as if sharing a distasteful confidence. "A man named Thomas Reed. He'd been pestering Harrison for months. Some ridiculous obsession with old business dealings from before I even knew him. Harrison thought he was a crackpot." "Thomas Reed," I repeated, filing the name away. "I'll look into him." I left her sitting there, a porcelain queen on her silk throne, surrounded by the sterile, soulless wealth her husband had bled for. She was hiding something. I could feel it in my gut, a cold, hard knot of certainty. But whether it was guilt, fear, or something else entirely, I couldn't yet say. Back in the main room, Miller was talking to a young, uniformed officer. "We found something," he said, his expression grim, leading me to Croft's study. The study was a shrine to a man's ego. Walls lined with leather-bound books he'd probably never read, a massive oak desk polished to a mirror shine, and a faint, lingering scent of expensive brandy and self-importance. On the desk, placed squarely in the center, was a single, pristine white feather. "Doesn't match the blackbirds," Miller said. "Lab is running it, but I'd bet my pension it's from a swan. Or an albatross. Something white, something pure. A white feather to contrast the blackbirds, purity and sin." The symbolism was heavy-handed, deliberate. It was a message, a signature. My mind started to churn. The ritualistic staging, the birds, the feather. It felt familiar, like a half-remembered nightmare. I'd spent years wading through the city's filth, and I'd seen my share of strange things. But this was different. This had the cold, meticulous touch of a true artist of cruelty. "There's one more thing," Miller said, rubbing his tired eyes. I ran the Mo through the cold case archives on a hunch. Found a few loose threads. Murders over the last decade. Different victims, different methods, but always theatrical. A touch of the bizarre. A stockbroker found in his office with his mouth filled with gold coins. A judge found drowned in his bathtub, which was filled with red ink. The press called the killer the dramatist. He was never caught. Went cold about 5 years ago. "You think this is him?" I asked, the chill in the room deepening. "I think," Miller said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, that whoever killed Croft is either copying him, or the dramatist is back in business. And if he is, God help us all. I left the Olympian Tower as the first hints of a bleak, gray dawn began to stain the eastern sky. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city slick and glistening, like a fresh wound. The name Thomas Reed echoed in my head, along with the image of a single white feather. This case was already growing tentacles, reaching back into the city's bloody past. My first stop wasn't my office. It was a small, dusty bookshop in the old quarter called The Last Page. It was run by a man named Silas, an informant of mine who dealt in secrets the way he dealt in rare first editions. The shop smelled of old paper, leather, and dust motes that had been dancing in the faint light since before I was born. Silas was a creature of the shadows, a small, bird-like man with spectacles so thick his eyes looked like startled oysters. He was perched on a stool behind his counter, engrossed in a heavy tome. "Jack," he chirped without looking up. "To what do I owe this intrusion? Has someone finally decided to make a film noir of my life?" "Morning, Silas. I need to know about a journalist, Thomas Reed." Silas finally looked up, closing his book with a soft thud. "Reed, the ghost chaser, a true believer. He was in here last week, looking for books on local secret societies. He was agitated, said he was close to something big, something old and rotten." "What kind of rotten?" "The kind that wears a tuxedo and owns the city, Jack." He mentioned a name, the Albatross Club. The name sent a fresh chill down my spine. "Thanks, Silas." I slid a 20 across the counter. He made it disappear without a sound. "Be careful, Jack," he called after me as I left. Men who go looking for Ambrose City's ghosts often end up becoming one. Armed with the name of the club, I headed to my office. I needed my library, my files, my whiskey. The sun was a pale, anemic disk behind the clouds as I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon. The fiery liquid did little to warm the chill that had settled deep inside me. I opened my file cabinet, the drawers groaning in protest, and pulled out my own collection of notes on the city's unsolved curiosities. The dramatist file was thin, full of speculation and dead ends. A ghost who killed with a poet's flair. Thomas Reed wasn't hard to find. He was a freelancer, a bottom feeder in the journalistic food chain, what they used to call a gutter rat. He was known for his obsession with conspiracy theories and the city's forgotten crimes. His byline was all over a dozen defunct blogs and small-time papers, always circling the same themes: corporate corruption, unsolved murders, the secret history of Ambrose City. He was, as Eleanor Croft had suggested, a crackpot. But crackpots sometimes stumble upon the truth, usually right before the truth turns around and bites their head off. I found his address in a grimy part of town where the buildings sagged with exhaustion and the alleyways smelled of despair and stale beer. His apartment was above a pawn shop, the windows dark and grimy, watching the street like dead eyes. I took the stairs, the scent of stale cabbage and damp growing stronger with each floor. The building's silence was heavy, oppressive. I knocked on his door, 3B. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, my knuckles rapping against peeling paint. A dog barked somewhere down the hall, a lonely, frantic sound. I tried the knob, unlocked. A jolt of pure, professional unease went through me. In this part of town, you lock your door against the world, against the things that creep in the dark. An unlocked door is an invitation to trouble, or a sign that trouble has already come and gone. I pushed it open. "Reed?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The apartment was a chaotic mess of paper. It was as if a library had exploded. Stacks of newspapers, open books, files, and printouts covered every surface, a testament to a mind consumed by a singular obsession. A map of the city was pinned to one wall, A complex, insane web of red yarn connecting dozens of locations, photos, and names. It was the den of a man who had fallen down a rabbit hole and never found his way back out. And in the center of it all, slumped in a worn-out armchair, was Thomas Reed. His eyes were open, staring at the yarn-covered map as if he had finally found the answer he was looking for. A neat, precise hole in his temple told me he wouldn't be sharing it with anyone. He'd been dead for a day, maybe two, long before Harrison Croft had taken his final, surprised look at his crystal chandelier. On the floor beside him was a spilled cup of cold coffee and a single, stark white feather. The police would call it a suicide. A desperate journalist, crushed by his obsessions, finally giving up. It was a neat, tidy explanation. Too tidy. I knew better. This wasn't an exit. This was an execution. This was the second move in a game I didn't understand, played by an opponent who was always one step ahead. I scanned the room, my instincts on high alert. I wasn't supposed to be here. Miller would have my hide if he knew. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Reed's work was a labyrinth, and somewhere in it was the key. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of a gloved hand. I always knew this day would come. I've been waiting for it for 30 years. That the past would come back to claim them. To claim us. A floorboard creaked behind me. My instincts screamed. I spun around, pushing Eleanor behind me, my gun already in my hand, the hammer cocked. A figure emerged from the fog, tall and broad-shouldered. It was Miller. "Jack," he said, his own gun leveled at my chest. His face was a hard, unreadable mask. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" "Miller? What the hell is this?" My mind raced. "Eleanor called me," he said, his voice cold, devoid of any of its usual weariness. "Said you were harassing her, threatening her." "That's a lie," I snarled. "We were talking about Julian Thorne. About a murder you helped cover up." Miller's face didn't flinch. "You've been digging where you don't belong, Jack, stirring up old ghosts. Some things need to stay buried for the good of the city." "The good of the city? Or the good of the men who pay your salary?" The pieces started to click into place. The stonewalling, the convenient suicide of Thomas Reed. Miller wasn't just a cop, he was a gatekeeper, the custodian of the city's darkest secrets. "This city is a delicate ecosystem, Jack," he said, taking a step closer, his gun unwavering. "You can't just go pulling on threads. The whole thing will unravel." Suddenly, another figure emerged from the fog, silent as a wraith. He was standing behind Miller. A tall, gaunt man in a dark coat, his face pale and hawk-like in the gloom. His eyes were ancient, filled with a sorrow so profound it was terrifying. In his hand, he held a long, thin blade that glittered faintly in the dim light. Miller hadn't seen him. He was still focused on me. "It's over, Jack," Miller said. "Give me the gun." "Miller, behind you," I yelled. But it was too late. The gaunt man moved with a liquid grace that was unnervingly fast. The blade flashed. Miller's eyes went wide with surprise, a gurgling sound escaping his lips as a dark line appeared on his throat. He slumped to the ground without another sound. The man stepped over Miller's body, his gaze fixing on me. He ignored Eleanor, who was frozen in a silent scream of terror. "He was here for me. Corrigan," he said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. It was a voice that had not been used for a long time. "The detective, the one who sees the patterns." "Julian Thorne," I said, my gun still steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He offered a slight, sad smile. "I have been watching you. You are more clever than the rest. You see the poetry in it all. The justice." "Justice? This isn't justice. This is revenge. Is there a difference?" He mused, taking another slow, deliberate step. They left me for dead on those rocks. I crawled out of the sea, broken, but alive. I have spent 30 years in the shadows, waiting. I have become a ghost, a story whispered in the dark. And now, I am simply collecting what is owed. He was insane, a man hollowed out by grief and rage, leaving only a vessel for vengeance. Why the birds, Julian? Why the theater? The albatross, he whispered, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light. The bird of ill omen that the foolish sailors killed. A weight to be carried around their necks for eternity. They named themselves. They wrote their own tragedy with their arrogance and cruelty. I am merely the final act. He raised the blade. And you, detective, you have seen too much. You have read the last page of the script. The story must end. He lunged. I fired. The sound of the gunshot was deafening. A brutal crack that shattered the night's silence. Julian staggered back, a look of genuine surprise on his pale face. He looked down at the dark stain spreading across his chest, then back up at me. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. Then, he crumpled to the pier, his long limbs folding at an unnatural angle. Silence descended once more, broken only by Eleanor's ragged sobbing and the distant, mournful foghorn. The fog began to thin, and in the distance, I could hear the approaching wail of sirens. Eleanor's call had been a double cross, but not in the way I had imagined. She hadn't called Millard to arrest me. She had called him to be a witness, or perhaps, another victim. I stood there over the two bodies, the killer and his corrupt protector, the gun still smoking in my hand. The case was over. The ghosts of the Albatross Club could finally rest. But as the flashing blue and red lights painted the fog, a cold, creeping dread began to snake its way around my heart. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. It was too simple. Too neat. A perfectly tied bow on a very messy package. Julian's words echoed in my head. I have been watching you. You see the poetry in it all. He had seemed to know me, to understand me. How? And then, another memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. The white feather. I had found one in Croft's study, and one in Reed's apartment. But there was another. I reached into my trench coat pocket, my fingers trembling. I pulled it out. A single, pristine white feather. Where had I gotten it? I couldn't remember. I couldn't remember finding it. It was just there, as if it had always been there. My mind started to race, a frantic, desperate scramble to connect the pieces. The blackouts, the moments of lost time I had dismissed as exhaustion and too much whiskey. The vivid, violent dreams that felt more like memories. The feeling of being watched, even when I was alone in my locked office. The carved wooden bird. The words of Dr. Horace Thorne about fugue states, about building a new personality to house a broken truth. The priest's words about a resurrection. I looked at my reflection in a puddle of rainwater on the pier. The tired, world-weary face of Jack Corrigan stared back. But for a fleeting, horrifying second, I saw another face superimposed over it. A younger face. A pale, hawk-like face with ancient, sorrowful eyes. No, it can't be. The journalist, Reed. The file on my desk. They're all guilty. That was my handwriting. Frantic, yes. Shaky, yes. But mine. I remembered writing it now, in a cold sweat, the words feeling like they were being channeled through me. Eleanor Croft. Her story. She had been talking to me, but her eyes had been filled with a terror that wasn't just for Julian Thorne. It was for me. She had been trying to remind me, to reach the man she once knew. He was beautiful, an artist, a poet. My father had been a poet. A failed, drunken poet who used to read me Poe and Coleridge as bedtime stories. Stories of guilt and madness and albatrosses. The truth hit me like a physical blow. A punch to the gut that knocked all the air from my lungs. It was a truth so monstrous, so impossible, that my mind had fractured itself to keep it buried, building a fortress of fiction around a core of unbearable pain. There was no Julian Thorne. There never had been. He was a story, a ghost I had created to bear the burden of my vengeance. I was the boy on the yacht, the gentle artist, the one they had tormented. My name wasn't Jack Corrigan. That was a fiction, a hard-boiled detective I had conjured from the pages of pulp novels I read as a boy, a persona strong enough, cynical enough, to carry the weight of what had been done to me, and what I had done in return. They hadn't killed me that night 30 years ago. They had done something worse. They had broken me. They had shattered my mind, and from the pieces, a monster had been born. And I had spent 30 years in the shadows, not as a ghost, but as two men living in one body. One, a broken boy nursing a decades-long thirst for vengeance. The other, a detective hired to hunt himself. The dramatist, the killer who saw poetry in death. That was me. I was the one who had arranged the blackbirds. I was the one who had planted the feathers. I had murdered Croft. I had murdered Reed when he got too close to the truth that even I couldn't face. And I had led myself, Jack Corrigan, on a perfectly constructed chase, a breadcrumb trail of my own making. I had been playing a game with myself, a deadly, intricate game of cat and mouse, where I was both. The sirens grew louder, closer. The flashing lights were almost upon me. I looked at the gun in my hand, then at the two bodies on the pier. One of them, the man I thought was Julian Thorne, was a stranger, a vagrant from a homeless shelter, perhaps paid and drugged. Just another piece of stagecraft, a final body to sell the lie to myself, a prop for the final act of my tragedy. Who was I? Was I the detective, the seeker of truth? Or was I the monster, the avenger cloaked in shadow? The two halves of my shattered mind collided, the wall between them crumbling into dust. Memories flooded in, not as dreams or whispers, but as stark, brutal reality. The feel of the blade in my hand as I stood over Croft. The cold look in my eyes in Reed's mirror. The cold satisfaction of a debt finally paid. The rain began to fall again, a soft, sorrowful drizzle, washing the blood from the pier, blurring the lines between the truth and the lie, between the man I had pretended to be and the monster I truly was. My name is Jack Corrigan. I'm a private investigator, and I have just solved my last case.